Mr. Shadid is based in the Middle East for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, Mr. Shadid worked as the Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press out of Cairo and as a news editor of the AP Bureau in Los Angeles. He spent 2 years covering diplomacy and the State Department for the Post and Globe before joining the Post Foreign Desk. In 2004, Mr. Shadid won the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for his coverage of the Iraq War. I will turn it over to Mr. Shadid.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thank the Palestine Center for organizing the conference today and for inviting me. And it's a great honor to share the table with Mr. Paul Finley. I first saw him speak when I think I was 16 or 17, and I've always thought he stands for the best of what American politics can represent. From what I understood from the organizers was I got to speak about what's gone wrong over the past 8 years, and Mr. Finley gets to speak about how to fix that. I think I can definitely say that I have the easier job. I think it's stunning when you look back at what's happened over the past 8 years. From my own personal, somewhat selfish perspective, it started with getting shot in Ramallah. In 2002, I got divorced. I was in Baghdad when the Americans invaded. I was in Beirut when the Israelis invaded. And then I got to go into exile for the past year or so to rebuild my grandparents' house in southern Lebanon. Now, I'm not sure I can credit the Bush administration with that last bit of fortune, but I definitely enjoyed it the most. For a year, I got to work on a book I'm trying to finish right now. I picked olives. I tried to choose old tile, the Levantine sort you see in these beautiful old houses in Nablus and Marjayoun and other places, Damascus. And I tried to make sense of a region that I think a lot of us feel doesn't make a lot of sense right now. In essence, I got all rested up so that I can go back to Baghdad in December for another year or two. I think every person that spoke today is probably better qualified than I am to speak about policy. I've never felt all that adept at it, either in writing or speaking, certainly not in journalism, where I think there are already way too many people speaking with way too much authority about subjects they don't know all that much about. I have to say, coming back to the United States and watching these news shows and seeing these journals, it reminds me of taxi drivers in Cairo. Who can answer any question. They'll be sitting there in the taxi, 4 fingers on the steering wheel. You'll ask them, what's up with nuclear fission? They'll take a drag on the cigarette, lean back and say, Habibi. So, with that in mind, I'm going to try not to be a Cairene taxi driver. What I'd like to do is take you through some of the experiences I've had over those years I mentioned, starting with the experiences in Baghdad, going through Beirut, and then to Marjayoun, where I've spent much of the past year or so, and try to maybe kind of offer a different perspective than we've heard today. We've heard a lot about policy, fantastic analysis, very interesting and compelling, but I try to maybe take it in a little more human direction if I can, because I think there is something that we've lost over the past 8 years, and I want to try to capture it if I can. I want to focus on this somewhat sad idea, defined as broadly as possible, and this idea is loss. I think it's the overwhelming narrative of our experience in the Middle East, and for that matter, my experience there since 2001. Time and again, it's what I've encountered as a reporter, and as importantly, as a resident of the region. I've seen it in Iraq, defined in so many different painful ways. I've seen it in Lebanon, a country that seems locked in this strange interregnum between war and peace. And I've seen it quietly in Marjayoun, the small dying town near the Israeli border where I've been living. And what is this loss? I've struggled with this in writing the book right now, how to define that loss. And I think to me it's the disappearance of an ideal, of an older notion of the Levant, of a certain cosmopolitanism, of a diversity and of a tolerance that I think is dwindling in the wake of the wreckage of U.S. policy in Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and elsewhere. And I think these two phenomena, I think this loss of this ideal and I think this wreckage of U.S. policy go hand in hand. And I have to say, I personally, I think I learned about this idea in striking up a friendship with a man I came to know in Baghdad. His name was Muhammad Hayawi. He was a remarkable guy. He was a bookseller on Motanevi Street. And there's one conversation that still lingers with me all these years later. It happened back in 2003 and on a summer day, and it still makes me smile when I think about it. This was a time when Iraq was still filled with these half-truths of occupation and liberation. It was before its nihilistic descent into carnage, that kind of mind-numbing violence that we still see today. Now, Hayawi was a bald bear of a man. He used to stand in his bookstore. It was called the Renaissance Bookshop. And he would kind of hold court in a way. I always loved this bookstore. It was remarkable for its mix of what it had. There were books by communist poets and martyred clerics, translations of Shakespeare, predictions by Lebanese astrologers, and there was actually a 44-volume tome by a revered Ayatollah. It was remarkable, 44 volumes. And these dusty stacks would spill out onto the floor. And I always remember Hayawi. He was hot. He was trying to cool himself with the fan. I remember sweat was pouring down his face. Now, this bookseller and I had met before the American invasion. We'd shared tea, and nearly a year later, he almost immediately recognized me as I walked through the door. Abu Layla, he said, and it was the name of my daughter. And when he addressed me that way, I always felt more friend than reporter and more neighbor than foreigner. And then he'd deliver a line to me that I would hear him say often. In fact, each time we met over the next few years. I challenge anyone, Abu Layla, to say what has happened, what's happening now, and what will happen in the future. He'd have his routine after he'd make a statement like that. He'd smoke on a cigarette. He had these huge bags under his eyes. He'd run his hand over his sweaty cheeks. And he said this line also more than once. Does this look like the face of 39 years? And on this day he offered that line along with another. He knitted his brow and he turned grimmer. We don't want to hear explosions. We don't want to hear about more attacks. We want to be at peace, he told me that day. In Iraq, he wants to put his head on his pillow and feel relaxed. And what he meant was that he didn't want to lose anymore. What he meant was that his fabled city, his persecuted country, had already lost too much. You know, I think there's so many ways to read loss over the past 8 years in the Middle East. In a way, I think Iraq is lost. And it's not only the physical sense of the word, a country that amazingly to me, managed to still show signs of resilience, but whose name still conjures up this collage of chaotic images, disturbing in their brutality and grotesque in their repetition. I thought it was put well in an article the other day, and I think the point was made this morning as well, that an absence of violence, or we should, I think more accurately, a decrease in violence, isn't a synonym for success. It's not simply the loss of, or the sense of American loss either, this arrogance that was conflated with ignorance that helped bring about this disaster. It's painfully a cultural legacy too, and I think a lot of people here probably feel that. Even the notion of Baghdad, of the name of the city and what that city used to represent, what that city still represents, I think, in the collective memory of the region. In fact, there's a verb that's not used all that often anymore, but it's to Baghdad. It remains one of my favorite words in the language. I like the sound of it and how expressive it is. To be honest, the only time I heard it used was by a sculptor I met, a guy named Muhammad Ghani, and some people may be familiar with him here. I think he liked this word because it represented a certain nostalgia, and he liked to mention it often. I went to see him about the same time as I saw the bookseller, Muhammad Hayawi, and the sculptor and I drove together in his car through Baghdad. He had been gone during the invasion. He had just come back, and I remember him staring out the window at a city that was now occupied. He kept looking in front, behind, and to the side, and I remember him uttering over and over, Allahu Akbar. From him on this day, it suggested resignation, I thought, as we drove through the city. Across the window, we're passing his city stories, basically. The temperature was outside, it was 120, 125 degrees, and you could feel it. Municipal services had collapsed, much as they still have today. U.S. soldiers in the street were pointing M16 assault rifles toward cars, and I remember a slogan inscribed on one of the tanks in the streets that day, "Love Machine," I remember it reading. You could see that Muhammad was affected by all this, that he was upset and disturbed, and I remember his words were unhurried. In a way, their slowness almost felt like a narcotic to me on the chaos outside. I swear to God, he told me, Baghdad is a beautiful girl, but her clothes are dirty. And I had met Muhammad, the sculptor, back in 1998, way before. I was still working with the Associated Press back then, and I was trying to make sense of Saddam's Iraq. Muhammad was an older man back then. He was 74 years old. He had these bushy black eyebrows. And I remember in a time that was shadowed by fear, he was someone that would speak to me. And I gave him a lot of credit for this. It wasn't an easy time. There was a lot of